One of the most interesting things about Overwatch is how much people love to not only love it, but also love to hate it. Even people that actually play the game. One of the biggest strengths of Overwatch 2 is the wide variety of characters, but that's also one of its biggest weaknesses as well. There's always a lot of variety, but there's going to be guaranteed some things that you really, really hate playing with or playing versus. Now, I ran a very interesting poll recently, at least I like to think so, that tried to answer the question, what is the worst or what are the worst characters in all of Overwatch 2 in terms of provoking these negative responses? And let's actually talk about what my results were. Now, to be very clear, this was a fun goal, a fun idea, but importantly, this is not a science paper. There's a heavy community bias from the people that I was sampling. It was within my Twitter community, YouTube community, and Discord community, which had an overwhelming higher rank bias. We'll talk more about that when I show you the numbers. In addition, even the lower ranked players in my community are generally a little bit more serious about the game and have a little bit more self-accountability than the average ranked player. There was not necessarily a large enough sample size initially. We only had around 2,200 forms filled out, which is still a lot, but it may not completely cover all of our bases. There was also some limitations in the poll. We didn't have every hero listed. It was definitely not ordered in rank of heroes that you hate to least hated. We'll talk about that in a second as well. And there's also heroes that generally hit peaks more, because even though they're not necessarily universally hated, when people hate them, they really hate them, because you had to prioritize which heroes that you hated the most. So there's a little bit of a bias in there too. Although that may not necessarily be a bad thing, because it's not really realistic for us to remove all hatred in this game, but removing the worst aspects of hatred. We know from human psychology that we have a tendency to remember the worst peaks of pain and agony, and not necessarily the overwhelming drudgery. You might not like playing with Sigma all that much or playing versus Sigma all that much, but if he doesn't necessarily provoke a severe negative response, it's really not going to be something that should be super worried about. And in addition to that, there's definitely some recency bias. We'll talk a little bit about that with overbuff pick rates, but generally people, more visible characters are going to be more hated as well. There are some exceptions to that. We'll talk about that, but people are going to be hating characters more when they're meta, because you're going to see with the worst aspects of those characters more often. The priority of this was just to spark discussion about a topic and to provoke general thought, including to answer one question, which we're going to be talking about a lot more in a future video. Stay tuned. But it's my personal suspicion that lower rank heroes, noob heroes, actually hurt noob players more. More on that in a later video. We might touch on that a little bit later, but let's actually get to the results here. So first off, this is exactly how the form looked like. You feel free to fill out the form if you'd like to. You could probably find it on my Twitter, in my YouTube community. But really, we're going to be moving on here. But this is just basically a basic structure: bronze, silver, gold. The reason why we did this is we want to discriminate between what I would call low to average rank players. We know the average rank is about gold. And I wanted to make sure that we had a low rank community, a mid to high rank community, and a very high rank community. These are not even demographics by any means. This is generally a very small percentage of the player base. This is generally at least half, if not more than half, of the average player base. Not necessarily in my community, but I wanted to have a very clear differentiation, because again, the goal was to provoke thought about, well, what do really high rank players think? What do good players think? What do bad and average players think? What role do you play the most? What two, you had to choose two at most. 10 heroes do you hate playing versus the most? And this is where you can see the limitations of this poll. Obviously, people were like, well, why didn't you do this? And why didn't you do that? Just for the interest of being a simple conversation starter, basically the way I looked at it is to improve this poll significantly would have taken significantly more work and more time, which I did not have. In addition to that, people would not have been as interested. Part of the reason why I got so many responses is because I was able to advertise that this will take 60 seconds, fill it out. Whereas a more in-depth poll would have taken a lot longer. And this is not a science paper, guys. This is just something to provoke conversation. So anyway, Doomfist, Malgott, Orisa, Roadhog, Wrecking Ball, you choose two out of those tanks. Notice that some of these feel like more high rank, annoying, high skill characters, Wrecking Ball and Doomfist, and some of them feel more like noob stompers. We're going to be coming back to that one in a little bit. What two damage heroes you hate playing versus the most? Again, we introduced a couple of noob stompers, along with some higher rank frustrating characters as well. What two sports you hate playing versus the most? Kiriko, Lifeweaver, Mercy, Moira, Zenyatta. Again, some higher rank, higher performance characters and some easier characters, and then a little coaching giveaway we're doing for that as well. So long story short, I wanted a variety of characters that are hated in higher ranks and that are hated in lower ranks, at least for my general impression, and the results did not disappoint, although they did not fail to surprise me at some points in time. I was able to accurately predict the order of all of these, with the exception of a couple of details that was wrong with the damage and support heroes, but I certainly was not able to predict the way it broke down by rank. We'll get to that one in a little bit. So let's actually look at the global results. Now, keep in mind, you can already see here that there's a heavy bias towards higher ranks. Platinum Diamond Masters is not 71, 72% of the player base, not by any means. It's probably closer to 30, 40% of the player base. But obviously, in the community that I'm in, they're a much larger percentage. In addition, the Grandmaster Champion, 7.5%. They're not 7.5% in the game. I would say they're probably closer to 2 or 3% in the game. And obviously, Bronze, Silver, and Gold is a lot bigger than 20.8%. So there's a heavy bias at the global results. Don't worry, we'll break it down by rank. What roles do you enjoy playing the most? Pretty even here. A little bit of a support, lack of a support, a little bit of an anti-support bias, but don't worry, we'll go to that one in a little bit. What 2 tank heroes do you hate playing versus? Now, I know that people did not read the question, right? I know that they did not read the question, and they're certainly even if they did read it, they're probably influenced by the anchoring effect, and we're influenced by the feeling of, oh, when I don't like playing versus that, right? And maybe it's not the anchoring effect, maybe it's the halo effect. I'll have to go back and look at my terminology here. But regardless, they're influenced by the fact that they're thinking about playing with the character as well. Roadhog, clear winner here. Malga, second place. Orisa, Doomfist, Wrecking Ball. You could probably have predicted this. In fact, when I did a poll in chat, I went through these results live. I reacted to these results live in chat yesterday. It was actually most of the Twitch chat got pretty close to this one. So that one's not a huge surprise here. What 2 damage heroes do you hate playing versus the most? Now, this is one where I started to get a little bit off. I thought Bastion would be higher. Bastion was actually in last place. So Sombra, Widowmaker, Junkrat, Torbjorn, Bastion. One of the things that we had to keep in mind is that the pick rates, win rates, a lot of the people hating these things were influenced by their visibility, recency bias, like how recently was that negative experience. And so I think when we look at this here, it's obviously here that Sombra, even though she's just obviously has a lot of things wrong with her kit, part of the problem is that she's just been picked a lot more. Like Sombra's always been like kind of a bottom dweller when it comes to pick rate, but even in all ranks, she's still in the top half, almost the top third of being picked. Even in freaking bronze. Bronze, she was like the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th most picked character, which is a big surprise to me. And so what you'll notice is there's a little bit of a bias towards people hating tanks that are picked higher. Roadhog is historically being picked higher more often now than he's ever been picked before, even in low and high ranks. Same thing goes with their support here. Like, no spoilers here, but Kiriko is going to be put in the top of this list. And part of the reason is because Kiriko is actually at a pick rate right now. Let's actually go to competitive here. Kiriko is at a pick rate right now that we've never really seen before with Kiriko since like the launch of Overwatch 2. So all the negative aspects of Kiriko are really kind of being put front and center. And I think that's causing a lot of issues with the tank in general. I want to point out as well that it's really difficult to know whether you should be prioritizing quick play or competitive when it comes to pick rates. Roadhog, for example, is inflated massively by quick play pick rates, so just keep that one in mind. Again, there's just no real way to have this one done perfectly, but regardless. So moving on here, we're going to move on to support. So this one was a bit of a surprise for me. I was not expecting Kiriko to be first place, even with the higher rank bias that I had in this poll. Kiriko, Lifeweaver, Mercy, Moira, and Zenyatta. Ignore the Ana one. That was an early iteration of the poll, which I changed almost immediately. And so long story short is that we have like a really goofed up perspective here where there's actually a pretty significant gap between a lot of the times the first, at least the top couple of most hated characters and everybody else. So the question is why? Why is this the case? Now, let's try and make some predictions, and I'm going to share with you my predictions that I made yesterday, and I'm going to try and show you guys where I went wrong. So my predictions, I mean, obviously everyone hates Roadhog, everyone hates Malga, everyone hates Orisa. No real big changes there, but the general consensus is that people don't like tank buster tanks. So Malga, Orisa, Roadhog all have tank busting as part of what they do. So tanks especially hate them, and everybody else doesn't really like them all that much either. People do not like damage characters that either you don't have a lot of interaction with or feel very difficult to interact with. They also don't like cheese characters, which kind of goes without saying, right? And then the support one was interesting. I was expecting Mercy and Moira to be higher on the list as low skill, no skill characters, but it was actually not just that. It was actually characters that in general, again, you did not interact with or it felt difficult to counterplay. We'll dig more into these as we get into this juice, which I would big shout out to my buddy Ryan and a Twitch viewer named Infinite Bliss who helped out with running the stats here because I wanted to break it down by a role. So I'm going to have this. You guys will have to forgive me for the face cam kind of being in the way, but you guys can still see the pie chart, and that's what we're really going to be looking at here. So the pie chart here is that in the bronze to gold category, let's compare Doomfist here. So Doomfist 13.4, 12.3, 14.0. About the same from all ranks. I was expecting to be a little bit more frustrating for higher ranked people, but seem to be okay with it. Mauga, 27%, 26.3, 24.3. People in lower ranks don't like Mauga as much. They hate him at least a little bit more. Obviously, what's a statistical significant percentage difference, 24.3 to 26.8. It's not that much, but it is worth pointing out just as food for thought. Moving on here, Orisa, 24%, 21.3, 21%. Again, Orisa perceived as slightly more annoying in lower ranks than she is in higher ranks. Very interesting. Moving on, Roadhog, 22.1, 30%, 31.3. And this was a really interesting one, and one that kind of made me think a little bit, because I was thinking, why is Roadhog the least annoying tank buster in lower ranks? And I think, well, we can guess that it's partially because there is a mechanical requirement for you to be able to get the worst, most annoying aspects of Roadhog out. For example, Mauga and Orisa have generally lower mechanical demands, at least at their very base skill floor. Whereas Roadhog, to be annoying with the character, you do have to hit your tooks, whether that's on the squishies or whether that's on the tanks. And that might be something that's not happening as often in lower ranks, and once you hit that floor, the character starts to actually beat out pretty significantly the other tank buster characters. Again, I want to point out here that I've always been an enemy of tank busters here, and regardless of whether you think there's a flaw with this poll or not. I know some people will be like, oh, you should put in Sigma, you should have put in Diva. It's pretty clear that the tank busters are hated. And we're actually going to go in a second to the results here. And spoiler alert, tank busters are not just hated by tanks. They're hated by all roles. That's something that I think the developers need to be keeping in mind moving forward when it comes to tank design. Finally, here we have the Wrecking Ball. This one was very surprising to me. I thought Wrecking Ball was going to be a little bit higher in the list. I thought it was going to scale to his skill. But I realized something here. Even though Wrecking Ball is hated in lower ranks, my opinion is that I think people are probably being influenced by playing with Wrecking Ball. And for somebody that's been coaching in low ranks for years, I mean, hundreds and thousands of VODs in low ranks, people don't like playing with Wrecking Ball in lower ranks. They really don't like it, more so than even in high ranks, because they don't understand how to play with Wrecking Ball. They don't understand that, hey, a tank isn't just a shield. And so there's some of that bias that kind of comes into mind, I believe, and that affected their poll result. That's my prediction anyway. I don't find, they could also say that maybe some of the crowd control that easily counters Wrecking Ball from plat up is a little bit harder to deal with in bronze, silver, and gold. Maybe Mines is more powerful in lower ranks. There's a lot of little things that we can guess here, but I think part of it is probably the most likely answer is the fact that it is the objective value is hard to measure. And low ranks don't really think about like what is a tank really. They don't really know the answer to that question. So interesting, food for thought. Let's keep moving on to the damage here. So damage characters. Again, we don't really have this broken down by rank, so keep in mind there will be some not by role, excuse me, so there will be some bias here. So bronze to gold. Bastion 14.8, 10.8, 6.7. This is exactly what we expected. I was surprised at how little Bastion was picked by all the ranks, but I was not surprised to see that low ranks really, really hate Bastion. I'll talk about that in a future video, but noob heroes hurt noob players. 14.8% all the way down. Junkrat, 17.44, 16.9, 20.1. Not statistically as significant, but it is interesting, though, that actually Junkrat starts to go higher up in higher ranks, despite being seen as a relatively low-skill character. There are some crazy GM Junkrat OTPs that I think one of my guesses is that the character is okay when you're really good at him, and even in higher ranks. The problem is there are some maps in certain comps where he's literally, you just can't play with him at all. Like he's dead weight is what he is. And so I think there's probably, again, some influence here. I don't like playing with Junkrat OTPs, and so I don't like him as a character, even if I'm thinking about playing versus him. So something to consider here. Moving on here, Sombra, and this is a big surprise to me too. Sombra is actually hated more in lower ranks, and we're going to keep bringing up visibility as a problem, even with new Sombra. I think, again, this is like the Wrecking Ball disease, where people do not like playing with Sombra in lower ranks. I remember coaching lower rank Sombras, and universally this character is flamed as much as a Widowmaker or a Wrecking Ball in lower ranks because people want to see a real DPS. They don't want to see you on Sombra. And so what ends up happening is people have a negative experience with Sombra across the board. Things like hack, things like backline assassinations are probably also easier in lower ranks as well, as there's an awareness gap. Obviously, that's a skill gap on both sides, but yeah, I think it was interesting to me. I thought Sombra would be scaling up, staying about the same, but it actually was worse for lower ranks. So really interesting to note here. Torbjorn about the same, no super significant gap here. Obviously, a little bit less annoying in higher rank because things like turret and hitbox are like way less annoying because he's just so easy to kill. And Widowmaker here. Now, this one was super, super unsurprising. People don't like Widowmaker. She was the second most hated DPS character, even in low ranks, but it definitely scales aggressively to where she absolutely dominates the higher ranks. And this is, again, kind of going with like how easy it is to counter Widowmaker, essentially infinite skill ceiling, infinite value ceiling. Character that it can be very frustrating to play against. She definitely in higher ranks dominates the lobby more than any other DPS. When they're on Widowmaker, everything changes, even more so than playing versus a Sombra, maybe more than almost any hero in the game. So just something that's very difficult and very frustrating to play against. Caricature hero design, again, more on that one as well in a future video too. Finally, move on to support here. So support, this one was interesting too. Let me actually zoom out just a little bit here. Okay, yeah, so there you go. So basically, Kiriko. Now, this one was a surprise to me. Kiriko stayed pretty much the same. I was shocked to see how much low-ranked players dislike Kiriko. I thought for sure that Kiriko would be relatively, whatever, Mercy Warrior or whatever, but Kiriko is still at the forefront. Now, I did notice here that Kiriko pick rates are pretty high, even in lower ranks. So you look at Kiriko, and not exactly the support I'd expect to be in second and third in bronze, silver, and gold, and yet here she is. So I think that's definitely worth kind of considering there. Visibility definitely affects this, but it is interesting to note that the Suzus and the flanking and all that kind of stuff is something that is annoying a lot of lower ranked players, even as much as some of the other characters here. For example, Lifeweaver, who was unequivocally the second most hated character, and something that was interestingly enough got worse in higher ranks. Again, I probably think people don't like playing with Lifeweaver as much as they don't like playing against Lifeweaver. There's going to be more to learn about playing with a Lifeweaver here, but man, people do not like the survival, sit in the back, and just AFK support, and more so in higher ranks than I expected. Mercy, this is pretty much expected. I think Mercy is pretty much universally hated. I do think that she's really, really bad in higher ranks right now. So if we jump ahead to Masters here, she starts to drop. We jumped ahead to Grandmaster, and she's down near the bottom. So that there's no surprise here that, at least in the higher ranks, that she's not as hated. But I think if that pick rate were to go up, I think Mercy would become number one really, really darn quick. People would be like, oh man, I miss Kiriko. But regardless, she is hated a lot in lower ranks. Almost the most hated support in lower ranks because of the free value, resurrect, and so on. So obviously, very difficult character, pretty much universally hated across the ranks. And Moira, this one was interesting to me. I thought this one would be a lot higher in low ranks, but this is also hated in higher ranks as well. Sorry, hated in low ranks. But yeah, it's actually pretty much the same all the way through. No significant gap between this. So this one was a bit of a surprise to me. I thought maybe it was be influenced by pick rates, but Moira is still dominating low ranks, and no surprise there. So kind of interesting to point out. And finally, Zenyatta. Some people debated me with this one. Some people were like, you should have put Ana in there. You should put Ana in there. And I could have definitely put Ana in there as well. So it was kind of a choice. If it was a coin toss between Ana and Zenyatta. I went with Zenyatta, and pretty much the same all the way through. There's a much more interesting thing to learn about the Zenyatta pick rate. We'll talk about that, and that's going to be broken down by role. So let's go ahead and move on to that here. So the role thing, and this is where things got really juicy. Again, shout out to my team here helping me out putting this together. You can see the breakdown to the role here, approximately the same. Support does have a significantly fewer amount of forms filled out when we initially ran the numbers, so that's going to explain why generally the green bars are going to be shorter. So don't read the bars in comparison to each other too much. You can a little bit, use your gut, but for the most part, it's more about the bars compared to each other. And this is the funny part, man. People, again, hate tank busters. And you can look at it across the roles here, right? The orange bars for Malga, Orisa, Roadhog. Green bars for Malga, Orisa, Roadhog. The blue bars for Malga, Orisa, Roadhog. Everybody hates tank busters. Everybody hates them. Nobody likes them. Roadhog was the most hated tank hero by tanks in the game. So this is the color scheme here. So blue is tank. Tanks hate Roadhog. Tanks hate Roadhog more than they hate Orisa, more than they hate Malga, more than they hate Doomfist, more than they hate Wrecking Ball. Now keep in mind, this is higher rank bias, right? Because we don't have this broken down by role and rank. We have one or the other. So there is going to be a little bit of high rank bias, and as we've already seen, if we go back to this here, that Roadhog is generally hated a little bit more by higher ranks, whereas the lower ranks have a little bit more of a problem with Malga and Roadhog. So what I would actually say here is I would say that Malga might be even worse than Roadhog if we were to factor in the lower ranked characters. But regardless, the tank busters are hated, regardless of what way you look at it. People freaking hate these characters, and they have they just hate them. They hate them. They do not enjoy playing with them at all. And it was honestly, I was astonished to see at how much more they hated them. Moving on down the list, again, we've known Roadhog, Malga, Orisa, Doomfist, Wrecking Ball. It pretty much follows the same order as the global, as did the tank. Moving on to damage here, Roadhog, Malga, Orisa, and this is where there's a slight gap here. Instead of Doomfist being more annoying as tank, Wrecking Ball's not that annoying. No surprises there. For DPS, Wrecking Ball is a little bit more annoying. It also probably depends on the type of DPS that you main. But yeah, Wrecking Ball is slightly more annoying than Doomfist. Moving on to supports here, and keep in mind the green bars are going to be lower because there is a significant amount of fewer number of supports, but it's the same order. It's Roadhog, Malga, Orisa. Now if we go here and we look at our support, our tank characters, we know that we have a higher rank bias. Again, we know that there's a bias away from Malga is the crucial thing. Away from Malga, and to an extent away from Wrecking Ball and Orisa. So if we put that in context here, again, I think considering how close Malga and Roadhog are, I think support players probably hate Malga and Roadhog at least close to equal. And there's a chance as well that Wrecking Ball is higher up on this list as well. But it was interesting to note that also for supports like Tank hate Doomfist more than Wrecking Ball. Wasn't really expecting that. I think it wasn't a huge surprise, but it's definitely something interesting to point out there. Okay, let's move along here. Hated DPS. Unsurprisingly, tanks hate Bastion a lot. It's the third most hated DPS despite its relatively low pick rates here. Now there is, again, a high rank bias, but even though we have a high rank bias, which is generally relatively indifferent to Bastion, he was still the third most. So actually here, I think if we actually had a better breakdown according to ranks, like there was an actually higher percentage of bronze, silver, and gold players, I think Bastion would either be the second or most hated DPS. Now, that was not a surprise. Bastion is relatively easy to deal with as a DPS and support. Big hitbox, slow, turret mode's not a big deal. CC, burst damage really ruins him. Range ruins him. But the number one character is Sombra. And again, that shouldn't be a surprise once you think about it. We talked about the visibility of Sombra being, actually that's a funny pun, being a lot higher than it normally is. But the main problem with Sombra, and if you notice all the bars are up here, is that she hurts everybody. Hack, Permastealth, EMP, and Virus hurts everybody. Virus hurts squishies, Hack hurts more tanks, EMP hurts everybody. And so Sombra is somebody that is a backline assassin and a tank harasser. And I want to be a little bit of a Sombra advocate, at least to an extent here. I do think her rework is a more skillful character. There's way more ways to punish her, but she still is really annoying. The concept of Hack and permanent stealth are still too, I hate to use the term fundamentally flawed, but they're pretty gosh darn annoying things in the game. And it is funny to see that because they affect all roles equally, then they're really hit. And we can't even blame this on a rank bias, because if we've already seen here, actually lower rank players hate Sombra even more here. So if anything, this number or this bar graph could be even higher if we were to include all ranks here, at least from our small sample size here. Okay, moving on here. For tanks, we talked about Bastion already, but Widowmaker is the close second, and that one was a bit of a surprise for me. I was expecting Bastion, but I guess it depends on the tank that you play, whether Bastion's annoying. And Widowmaker certainly has the difficulty of being something that you can't really interact with. You might be killing your backline, but you yourself can't really do that much about it, and that that helplessness can be very difficult to deal with here. Torbjorn, heavier tank damage, Junkrat, and so on, about the same. No big surprises there. Moving on here to the DPS, Sombra still the number one hated. That's going to be followed up by Widowmaker. That's Junkrat. Big surprise for me there. I guess DPS players end up dueling Junkrat more. Interesting here. Torbjorn, again, depends on the DPS. And Bastion, again, unsurprisingly, not all that annoying. And then again, we do have a bit of a high rank bias. So if we go back here and just kind of ballpark it here, we need to remember that in general, let's see here, Widowmaker is hated a little bit more by higher rank players and less by lower rank players. So Widow is probably a little bit higher than deserved on this bar graph here. Let's see what else do we have here. I think Bastion tiers down. So again, Bastion, even for damage players, would probably be up a little bit higher if we were to pull things more equally. And then Sombra probably could be even higher if we were to pull lower rank characters for damage. So Sombra could be even higher. And I think that's mostly it, the most statistically significant things. Maybe Junkrat could be a little bit lower. But yeah, worth noting. Support. Sombra, most annoying. Don't need to elaborate there. Widowmaker, most annoying for support. So even with a smaller sample size of supports, Widowmaker crushed everybody. In fact, Widowmaker, if we had more support forms filled out, an equivalent amount would probably be somewhere up here. Way higher. In addition, moving on there, Junkrat's more annoying for support players than it is for tank, but not quite as annoying as it is for DPS. Bastion's about the same. Torbjorn's a lot less annoying for supports to deal with again, which is kind of interesting. Maybe you don't really deal as much with some of the more annoying things. You don't have to duel him like a Tracer or a Genji have to. So anyway, no huge surprises there, but it is worth noting, and we'll keep moving on. Last role here, And again, these are not broken down by rank, so we do have to kind of keep that within context. Yeah, let's just address the elephant in the room. DPS players hate Kiriko. Okay, we'll get back to that in a little bit. But tank players. This one was a surprise to me. Even with the high rank bias, well, actually, the high rank bias went the opposite way because Kiriko stayed remarkably hated, even in lower ranks, right? So even though it definitely, I mean, it really didn't go up from what our sample size did. So Kiriko, it seems like tanks hate Kiriko. Even low rank tanks hate Kiriko. And that was a bit of a surprise to me. So Kiriko, Lifeweaver, Mercy, Moira, Zenyatta, relatively staying the same. No real surprises here outside the fact that I was not expecting tank players to hate Kiriko as much. I guess if all the Reinhardts out there are tired of getting Suzu'd, all the dive heroes and Suzu for JQ and Suzu for Shatter and Suzu and TP for your Winston and he can't dive the character. And anyway, long story short, I guess people really do hate Kiriko, regardless of what role. Obviously, supports are not as focused on the Kiriko hate because they don't have to interact with her as much. But yeah, worth pointing out. Moving on here from tank, it pretty much follows a statistical trend here. No big gap here. But I think there's one other thing to point out here. Let's just do it by character, actually. People really hate Lifeweaver. I think this is one thing that really stood out to me is that when we consider like the visibility of Kiriko, right? And you compare the visibility of Kiriko with the visibility of Lifeweaver, there's a bias there that it shocks me how much people hate Lifeweaver, even though his pick rate is really, really low. Even in high ranks, even in low ranks, it doesn't seem to matter. People just freaking hate Kiriko and Lifeweaver. And I want to go back and point out, I guess, as well, 22, 24, 29, high pick rates all the way through, right? Either the second or third most support all the way through. And man, that is a big concern because one of the things about Kiriko is that the pick rates are high and the hatred is high. So it's a high risk, high reward character. It's a character that a lot of people like playing or a lot of people feel like they need to play, but also has a lot of people hating it. So it's like it cuts both ways, right? But Lifeweaver is actually one of those characters which I honestly, I'm going to be blunt and say it's a failed hero design because people don't like playing it and people don't like playing versus it. So why does a character exist? Now, I know a lot of people are being like, are you saying delete Lifeweaver? No, I'm not saying delete Lifeweaver. I don't think that's realistic, but it is going to be a red flag for any character that has a low pick rate and a lot of hate. That is a big, big, big failure, I think, on the development team because you have a character that isn't bringing people joy and is bringing people a lot of frustration. That's the opposite of what you need to be doing in this game. So Lifeweaver, despite having a really tiny pick rate, not a lot of visibility, people freaking hate playing versus and probably playing with a Lifeweaver as well. Mercy kind of falls in that category too, although Mercy has certainly a much higher pick rate globally. Obviously, there's a fourth place instead. I think Mercy hate is, again, one of those things where it's like, especially in lower ranks, there are a lot of people that like playing Mercy. She is a unique character, so you have to be very careful about what you do with Mercy. I think she's definitely Pandora's box when it comes to balancing there. Moira, again, high pick rate. Probably has to do with how easy she is. I won't go down the Moira train. And then Zenyatta. And there's a couple of little details worth pointing out here that Moira is a little bit hated more by DPS players, even though we had a higher rank bias. People don't like playing with Moira all that much. Support players, DPS players don't like Zenyatta all that much. But tank players obviously don't like Zenyatta quite like more so than damage players. Not a big surprise there. Not by much. I was expecting it to be more. Discord being something that people complain about all the time. But it wasn't as big of an issue. It is worth noting as well that support players, this is pretty much the same as tanks. So support players are not, I was surprised that support even cared about Zenyatta at all, but it seems like at least a decent number of support players did vote for Zenyatta. So that's worth pointing out there. Not really sure exactly what that means. We'd have to sit there and think about it. But beyond that, I think that that's pretty much our conclusions here. In terms of food for thought here, I think if we were to go down through our list here, like talk about like what are some things that we need to be talking about. People hate tank busters. It doesn't matter what rank, it doesn't matter what role. People don't like playing with versus tank busters. People hate it. People also don't mind tank players, especially that dislike Bastion. People universally hate Sombra because she hurts all roles. And people also seem to universally hate Widowmaker because there's a lack of a feeling of interaction. Finally, going to the support. Kiriko seems to be actually a bit of a plague through all ranks. Now, I will say that this is partially where you wonder how much of the Kiriko hatred is just parroted by people parroting content creators. Also, again, there is the bias of the fact that maybe people within my community are more aware of Kiriko's fundamental flaws that the average player doesn't really care about. But I think, if nothing else, Lifeweaver is a big, big, big red flag considering his low pick rate and people hating him as much as he is. and so on. So what do you guys think? What were some, like, not conclusions, but what are some questions that have been raised by these numbers? What do you think that I should have been doing? What do you think the developer team, should be doing better on their end moving forward? I think that a lot of this was just more about prompting discussion rather than drawing hard conclusions, but I do think that there's some questions that have to be answered here. Now, when it comes to a lot of the easy noob hero stomps, the character design, dynamics, and so on, and go talking about Kiriko as well, by the way, I've got a couple of video series that I'm working on called The Fundamental or Fatal Flaw of Overwatch 2. There's going to be a 2-part series. There's going to be a long-form podcast discussion talking about the flaws and the difficulties of game design. I think you guys are going to find that pretty fun. I'll let you guys know. Well, you'll see it on my YouTube channel when I post it. Anyway, have a wonderful rest of your day. Let me know what you guys think in the comments.